We live in, at the moment, in this rather silly political season of presidential elections, and of course it produces an immense number of cliches. One of the cliches which we find is this notion that we are at an unparalleled moment of opportunity, potentiality, and possibility if only we can seize it right. Now, the trouble with cliches is, well, that they're just cliches. They're not necessarily wrong. So I want you to imagine for a moment, or maybe for the next half hour, that indeed we are at a moment of tremendous potentiality, possibility, and opportunity for those of us who remain basically loyal to the Marxist socialist tradition, and ask the question, how can we seize this moment and do something with it in a very positive kind of way, and what kinds of things will we have to do in order to do it? In putting it this way, I want to emphasize the importance of the Marxist socialist tradition in general. And I want to begin, I think, by pointing out the tremendous significance that tradition has had in changing the kind of the nature of the world which we now live in. It never managed to overthrow capitalism, but it sure as hell changed it and made capitalism adapt, shift. And in many ways, for a lot of people, that was a very, very singular effect, and something that I think we ought to be collectively proud of. I think going beyond that, of course, it could be argued, and indeed I would argue it as well, that the effect of all of this activity on the part of socialism and Marxism has been to save capitalism from itself, to save capitalism from its horribly self-destructive capacities and tendencies, and that in a curious kind of way, the socialist Marxist movement on a global basis over the years has helped stabilize capitalism without overthrowing it. And it's done that for one very simple reason, as Marx commented in the chapter in Capital, when he said, left to itself, competitive capitalism will lead to the destruction of all forms of wealth, in particular the two forms of wealth so fundamental to capital, i.e. that of the laborer and that of the soil. And it seems that destructive side of capitalism is something that we're still combating, and combating in very realistic ways. The destruction of the laborer in all kinds of ways, and the destruction of the soil. And for that reason, it's not simply sufficient to kind of say, well, we have a role to play in ameliorating this goddamn awful system. What we really have to do is to really think about the whole kind of question of overthrowing it, replacing it, finding that alternative to this system to which we are repeatedly told there is no alternative. Now, in pursuing this objective, I want to just raise the question of the necessary conditions that can, as it were, feed into such a kind of political project. The classical way of doing things is, of course, to do a thorough analysis of the contemporary situation in all of its details and all of its ramifications, and to theorize it in such a way that we then learn to think about what possible political practices there are, so that we can bring forth the new society out of the, as it were, the wreckage of the old. This analysis, of course, means that we need to analyze in great detail in ways that I couldn't possibly attempt in a short talk of this kind. But I want to concentrate on just two elements of the contemporary situation and regard them as rather key in terms of the analysis. And I want to look specifically at, first, globalization, and secondly, at the revolutions in productive forces, the sort of transformations of technology and science which have gone on over the last 30 years. I want to argue in both cases that while globalization has been around for a very, very long time, and there are all these famous statements in Communist Manifesto, and you can go back much, much further, and that it's been always an inherent part of what capitalism has been about and capital accumulation has been about, that over the last 30 years there have been some quantitative shifts in what globalization is about, which may have generated some qualitative changes that we need to address in terms of our political responses. I want to argue the same thing about productive forces, that while the whole revolutionary strategy of capital in relationship to productive forces has been there all along and has been a fundamental aspect of capitalist history, that indeed also in that sphere too there are some revolutionary movements over the last 30 years which I think require very specific attention and very careful kind of attention. But in both instances, both of globalization and with respect to the productive forces, I want to argue that these are central contradictions within the capitalist system, that they're not simply flat kind of dimensions which we have to confront, but they are deeply contradictory, and by concentrating on the contradictions, I think we'll start to find some of the levers which are there for change. One of the contradictions which exists within the globalization argument is, of course, the connectivity which is presupposed between the individual, the body, the political person, and the global processes of connectivity achieved through the market, through exchange of commodities, goods, information, and people. And that tension between, as it were, the micro of the individual and the macro of the global is, of course, generating this huge interest these days in notions of human rights, which Gayatri has invoked. I think this is a very important dialogue to look at. And it's a problematic one, because I think in the realm of human rights, capitalism is perpetually promising things that it can't deliver. And that by concentrating on what it can't deliver, we are in some sense empowering ourselves to move politically, both in relationship to the individual person and the global situation. But I also want to make another argument about globalization. And I'm not going to go into my particular cut on globalization. There are N books about it. We all have our own sort of view of it. I've written out mine. I don't want to go into that. But one of the other elements I want to try to unpack is to make very clear that globalization is constructed in a very interesting kind of way, and we should pay attention to this feature. That indeed there are a set of global institutions now, and there's a lot of talk about global governance and so on, which I'll come back to. And that global level of activity is important to look at and to think about. But that global activity is actually constructed in some ways through the existence of very distinctive regional power blocks, Europe, Japan, United States, and that we have also to think about the way in which the world is disaggregated into these major power blocks and what those power blocks are doing in relationship to each other. They are not necessarily in accordance. There is a lot of tension between them. And I would mention historically, of course, in the 1930s, those sort of power blocks went to war with each other. And that is not unfeasible. So that at the lower level there is that sort of configuration of regional power blocks. Then, of course, there is the nation state. I think it's absolutely ridiculous to say the nation state is unimportant. Absolutely ridiculous. The nation state is still an extremely powerful institution. In fact, I think what we have constructed now is not neoliberalism, but a kind of state monopoly neoliberal capitalism, if you want to call it that. What on earth are we doing when we say Singapore is an example of neoliberalism? The United States. Yes, the United States is getting out of the welfare state and, is getting out of many of those things, its social protections and so on. But what the United States is doing is supporting capitalist activity. In my own city, there's hardly any development that occurs that is not public financed. We have this thing called the public-private partnership. And in my city, this amounts to the public taking all of the risk and the private taking all of the profits. And the other interesting thing is, where is risk in this capitalist system these days? Long-term capital management goes belly up, and what happens? The Federal Reserve assembles everybody and bails them out. I mean, to say that this nation state doesn't matter anymore seems to me to be kind of crazy. But that is, again, that level of the nation state is crucially important. But beneath that also we have regional configurations, state configurations. And in some cases we have even regional separatist movements in Europe. And also, even in the United States, you know, what California is about is different from what the Northeast is about. I mean, there's lots of regionality, and then there's a metropolitan level, if you like, and then you come down to the community level, my local neighborhood, and then you come down to the person and the individual. And I want to argue that if globalization means anything, it is a series of activities across these different scales which are connected in very specific kinds of ways, and we have to appreciate those connections because each one of those connections is a site of potential political action, and I want to come back to that in the way of conclusion. The other element of globalization which is crucial in all of this is, of course, uneven development. We're all very familiar with the tales of, you know, absolutely obscene transformations in income distribution power which has gone on, and class distribution and power, but there's also been a process of uneven geographical development where rich regions have grown richer and poor regions have grown poorer. I mean, even within the United States you will find this going on, within metropolitan areas you'll find this going on, and of course between countries you'll find this going on. So there's, as it were, an unevenness in the whole thing, in which capital works on an uneven terrain. It makes use of the unevennesses it finds in very specific kinds of ways, but it also produces unevenness in a different kind of way, a new kind of way. And we have to look at that whole kind of process of production of uneven geographical development and uneven class power. We have to look at that, I think, again, as something being very specific. But within this system, of course, we've also witnessed massive oppositional movements. I mean, if you ask yourself the question, where is opposition to this system to be found? The answer is all over the place, everywhere. In my local community, in my local city, with the struggle over a living wage, in the sorts of movements that you'll find in many countries against the depredations of finance capital, or against the pirating of biological resources and so on. I mean, you know, if you had a sort of a map of oppositional movements, you'd find it all over the place. It's not that there's lack of opposition. It's everywhere. But the opposition is, of course, fragmented, often frequently local, often built around very specific kinds of questions and issues. And so one of the things that comes out of this analysis, which is one of the things I want to put on the table, is what do we do as academics and intellectuals in trying to create a framework of knowledge and understanding which permits connections to be seen and understood between all of these diverse oppositional movements? Are there ways to start to think about the commonalities that bind them together? And are there ways that we can work in more constructive and creative ways, instead of emphasizing all of the differences, to actually talk about the differences being meaningful and important, but at the same time, as it were, containing certain commonalities which can be the basis of some kind of common political project, some sort of common political action. Now, on science and technology, the productive forces. Indeed, I think much of what's happened over the last 30 years has been a very, very powerful transformation of capacities and powers through computer revolution and the like, information technology, information transfer and the like. And the question arises on that as to how exactly it is going to be used, and are there progressive and emancipatory ways in which it can be used, as opposed to kind of saying, this is just another capitalist plot, let's dump it. But there's another aspect to this which I want to draw attention to. And I don't want to go into the information because Gayatri's covered it, and we can come back to it, I'm sure, in the discussion. And that other aspect really concerns the way in which scientific understandings these days of, in the realms of biology, genetics, mind-brain relations, those kinds of things, are actually putting us in a position right now to interfere in the evolutionary process, interfere in very fundamentally direct biological ways in the evolutionary process. We've always interfered in the evolutionary process via our technology, our culture, our economy, and our politics, and all the rest of it. And that side of evolution has always been there, and it always has had certain biological implications, including species extinction and the like. But what we're actually facing right now is a situation where human choice, human action, direct human action, is going to have very powerful biological consequences. And I think at this point the question then arises, who is going to decide about those biological kinds of choices? Who's going to decide about this evolutionary trajectory? Is it going to be decided by, Dow Chemical and Monsanto and all the biotech companies? Who and how? And is there a possibility to bring it under conscious choice? And I think if we insist that this has to be a conscious political choice in which there is a great deal of popular participation as to who it is we want to be in the future and what kind of human being we want to see in the years to come, then it seems to me this is a very powerful rhetorical argument that leads, as it were, to some very strong political possibilities. Now, let's look immediately then at some of the potential political responses to those two particular situations. I mean, it's a very much more complicated problem in lots of ways, but let me just look at political responses to them. What you're finding worldwide coming out of globalization and all that goes along with it, and the institutions of political governance, and in relationship also to this revolution in productive forces, is a growing sort of set of discourses which are about the morality and ethics which attach to the global scene. You'll find this in literature that attaches to cosmopolitanism and the sort of ethics of cosmopolitanism. What's that all about? The attempts by writers like David Held to kind of talk about some sort of cosmopolitan democracy and the ethics and morality involved in that. You'll find, as it were, a whole terrain of debate which is beginning to sort of focus in on these questions of moral and ethical dimensions to what capitalism is about. Now, you can sort of dismiss that as hot air and the typical rhetorical flourishes by which the bourgeoisie disguises its real activities and so on, and I'm indeed sure a lot of that does go on. But I think there's some virtue in taking that debate at face value, particularly since you will find it at other levels also. The Catholic Church, just to take one. The Pope has launched this whole kind of question of the new humanism for this century. And what is the new humanism about? The new humanism is about trying to define what it's going to mean to be human under conditions of globalization and technological change. That is precisely what the religious rhetoric is now seeking to define. And the church is finding ways to empower itself, i.e., to start to go to people and say, look, your life is being constructed by these forces. What does it mean to you, and how can we actually bring you back into the conversation in a curious kind of way? The church has always sought to speak for the subaltern, and it will continue to do so for a long time, but it also has to find a rhetoric that's meaningful to its constituents, which are these days very much located in the poor, the impoverished, the marginalized, and the oppressed. So this debate on what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be human in terms of the kind of societies that are being developed right now, that is, as it were, a key debate. And the question then arises, well, what does the Marxist socialist tradition have to say about that? Well, of course, if you go back into the economic and philosophic manuscripts, you will find a whole range of different concepts which are pulled together in a very specific kind of way around that issue, trying to define what is it that we're alienated from. And one of the key concepts in there is this notion of species being. We are a species. We have capacities and powers. What are we like as a species? How do we understand ourselves as a species? What are potentialities? What's our relationship to other species? How does this work out? Are we a homogeneous species? Or do we have specific diversities and capacities and powers and so on? So it seems to me that one of the ways in which we could get back into that debate is to say, look, this whole notion about globalization and all of these ethical and moral dilemmas which you're posing are actually forcing us back to that very basic kind of question. What does it mean to be human? can we say something about species being, and what does it mean? Now, this notion of species being is, of course, a dangerous notion. It's a dangerous notion for a number of reasons, and one is because it can be sort of, as it were, easily homogenized or turned into something which is so unitary and essentialist that in the end it can be exceedingly damaging to the prospects for any kind of lively sorts of change. But I want to suggest that we can avoid some of those dangers by, as it were, beginning on a debate and a process around the question of what it means to be human in these times as part of the leading and cutting edge of the critique of capitalism, and to say it's basically the inhumanity of capitalism, its inability to treat us as human beings that is at the core of one of the reasons why it has to be gone and give way to something else. But as I've suggested, we need to be careful in this process, careful for a number of reasons. Firstly, we have to be careful because we've got to recognize that when we launch into a debate of this kind, we're likely to find ourselves caught in a certain situatedness of our knowledge. Now, a great deal has been made in recent years about the notion of situatedness. And I think it's fine, but I think there's a certain trivializing idea about a notion of it. You know, the fact that I'm a sort of nearly dead white European bourgeois male who works in Johns Hopkins University, and that therefore says, okay, you know, I mean, that's a kind of trivialized version, and I know I'm caricaturing. But there's a rather deeper sense of it. For example, let's look at our situatedness within the division of labor in society. I work in a university. University is not a socialist institution. It is not a good socialist place. I have to do all kinds of things that I don't want to do in order to, you know, keep my job and all the rest of it. And through that division of labor, I find myself actually assuming a kind of consciousness which is part of the institution, and I become, as it were, one of those people in there who just does those things, and I think that way because that's where I happen to be. And I often don't even recognize that it's my situatedness within this sort of labor process which is actually affecting many of the things I say. You can see that, by the way, in this conference. That there's a sort of confusion sometimes between what people are trying to do in order to actually make it in academia, which is nothing wrong with that because you've got to make it in academia if you're going to be there. Nothing wrong with that. There's confusion between that and what we want to say as socialists, you know. And I think we've got to recognize that contradiction in ourselves and work with it. You know, I mean, I'm not guilt-tripping anybody for sort of, you know, doing what the man wants inside of universities, because that's what we have to do a lot of the time. So recognizing our situation in the division of labor, and also something else here about this project. And this reflects also on this conference, and maybe it's a hard thing to say. But if we're going to have this debate about species being, we need the scientists. We really need the scientists. We need the microbiologists. We need the geneticists. We need to be in dialogue with them. We need them right in here. You know, it's fine that Marxism is well established in the humanities and in cultural studies and all the rest of it, and I think it's great. But if it just stays there, it gets ghettoized, and by being ghettoized, loses the possibility to actually engage in this debate. We need that debate with the scientists, and they're very hard to debate with. There's also something else which is always troublesome, which is the hidden geography of knowledge production. You know, some Europeans who come to this country and listen to the American left kind of look in absolute astonishment at what they hear. Because, I don't know, it's almost like people on the left in this country develop a set of concerns and then pretend it's universal without even recognizing it. There is a hidden geography of knowledge production which you also have to recognize. And the danger I'm trying to point to is to say, look, if we launch into this debate about species being and we don't recognize these contradictions within the university, our positions within the division of labor, the hidden geography of knowledge production, all those kinds of things, we're likely to get things terribly, terribly wrong. But if we recognize some of those things, we can actually, I think, make a difference. Then there's the other side of things. I mentioned earlier the way in which globalization gets constructed through these different scales of activity and action. And it's interesting when you look around you and you say, people these days often think that real political change is going to occur at just one or other of these levels. At the individual level, we have the slogan, "The personal is political." Well, I think that's terribly important. You can't do without it. But if that's all you've got, forget it. The same would be true about collectivities and solidarities and communities and so on. A lot of people now would kind of say the solution to all of the kinds of global problems we got is something local called community. Something very, very, very local, and we can solve the problems at that level. Well, community activism is terribly important, but of course in itself it can become exclusionary, reactionary, neo-fascistic in some instances, and is really, really problematic, but you need that level of activity in order to do anything. The same is true with organization at regional metropolitan levels. You know, Catalonia or Scotland or something like that. I mean, that kind of level, yes, you know, it's a level of political organization. Something can happen there, something can be done there. It's important to work at that kind of level. And it's vital also to work at the level of the nation state. Now, there are some people who nowadays say, well, actually, real political change is going to come from the institutions of civil society, not from the state, and think that's where the action's going to be. I'm very skeptical. I think the institutions of civil society are terribly important. They can play a role, but in themselves, all they're going to do is ameliorate capitalism and just sort of drift it back to what it's doing. They're going to end up being sort of a welfare, sort of a privatized welfare state structure. And the same is true of, you know, European assemblies and institutions of global governance like the WTO, World Bank, and these meetings on, you know, the sort of Beijing meeting on women or the Rio meeting on the environment and Kyoto and all those kinds of things. I want to argue that political action has to be construed as being significant at all of those levels simultaneously, and that we will lose entirely on the game if we think it is located at only one of those levels. That what you need to do is to start to think through how the personal is political relates to the collectivity, relates to the region, relates to the nation state, relates to the larger aggregate, relates to institutions of global governance. Because it's all very well saying abolish the WTO and IMF and all the institutions of global governance, but we need some kinds of institutions of global governance given the state that we've now created. There is finally this point, and I want to end on this. I want to insist. You know, Marx had this fantastic metaphor which I've used again and again, probably overused, which is the metaphor of the architect and the bee. It says, you know, what separates the worst of architects from the best of bees is the architect erects a structure in imagination before creating it upon the ground. Most of us in our daily lives, I'm sorry to report, really act like bees. And we can't do anything else. And I think it's important to recognize that. But at the same time, we need to cultivate an architectural imagination of the sense that says, I, we, you can be architects of our fates and fortunes. And that means liberating the imagination in certain kinds of ways about alternatives. Saying, look, there's a positive alternative out there. How can it be set out? Traditionally, it's been set out by the utopian tradition. The negotiation of the resurrection of interest in that tradition is present in this conference. And I think that the renegotiation of those possibilities which are there within the utopian tradition and a critical engagement with them is one of the ways to go. It's a liberatory kind of thing to do. To say to people, look, society could be organized in a completely different way. And if I ended the last book I did with a utopian sketch, a sort of little novella of a utopia, it was precisely to say, look, we could all do this. And it is through the liberation of the imagination, that kind of way, that we can start, as it were, to engage on this, re-engage on this political process. This political process, of course, in the end, has to look at finding commonalities within the differences. And I'm sorry to report that if we're fighting capitalism, the commonality that must lie within the differences is that of class. There's no avoiding it. You can call it what you like. You can try to evade it. You can run away this way and that way and this way and that way. But in the end, it's going to take class action, class consciousness, class work, class organization, if we're going to make any kind of dent on this system. So I'm actually very optimistic about the possibility of interventions at the intellectual level and the political level in the contemporary situation. We have a fantastic opportunity. We have a fantastic opportunity with lots of potentialities. And I guess my big question is, why aren't we going to use them? Why would we turn our back on this possibility right now? It's a wonderful moment. Let's use it. Thank you.